It was just before dawn in December 1944. Snow covered the forests of the Ardennes and a young German infantryman sat shivering inside a foxhole. The cold had become a constant companion. His boots were soaked, his gloves were worn through. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, American and German forces were preparing for another day of fighting in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The soldier had seen almost everything the war could throw at a man. He had survived Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front, he had survived British bombardments in North Africa, he had marched through countries whose names he could barely pronounce and fought battles that had already begun to blur together. Yet on this particular morning, there was one sound he feared more than anything else. It wasn't gunfire. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't even the roar of Allied bombers overhead. It was the distant rumble of American engines. At first, the sound was faint, almost impossible to distinguish from the wind moving through the frozen trees. Then, it grew louder. Trucks, half-tracks, tanks, hundreds of vehicles moving somewhere beyond the horizon. The sound rolled across the forest like distant thunder. The German soldier later told his comrades that hearing those engines meant only one thing: the Americans were coming again. And unlike almost every army Germany had fought during the war, the Americans never seemed to stop. This was strange because only a few years earlier, many German soldiers had not thought much of the United States Army at all. Nazi propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, spoiled, and incapable of fighting a modern war. German newspapers mocked the United States as a nation of movie stars, businessmen, and factory workers who would collapse the moment they faced experienced European soldiers. Many German officers believed it. After all, Germany's military reputation in the early years of the war was unmatched. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks. France had fallen in little more than a month. German armies had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. To many German commanders, the arrival of the United States into the war seemed less like a threat and more like an inconvenience. Then came Kasserine Pass. In February 1943, American troops experienced their first major clash with veteran German forces in North Africa. The results appeared to confirm everything German officers believed. American units retreated in confusion. Tanks were abandoned. Communications broke down. German armored formations smashed through inexperienced defenders and inflicted thousands of casualties. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces achieved one of the most decisive victories Germany would ever win against American troops. For German soldiers who fought there, the lesson seemed obvious: the Americans were amateurs. But something happened after Kasserine Pass that German commanders did not expect. The Americans learned. Most armies required years to absorb the lessons of defeat. The Americans seemed to do it in months. Officers were replaced, training methods changed, equipment was improved, tactics were rewritten. Mistakes that might have crippled another military became valuable lessons. German veterans who fought throughout the war repeatedly described how quickly American forces evolved. The army they faced in Sicily was stronger than the army defeated in Tunisia. The army they encountered in Normandy was stronger still. By the final year of the war, many German soldiers barely recognized the enemy they had once dismissed. What frightened them was not simply that the Americans improved, it was how fast they improved. Again and again, German forces discovered that weaknesses identified in one battle seemed to disappear by the next. Problems that had once made American units vulnerable were corrected with remarkable speed. The enemy was learning while the war was still being fought. But adaptation alone was not what terrified German soldiers. The real fear came from what followed the sound of those engines. When American forces arrived, they rarely arrived alone. Behind every rifle company came trucks loaded with ammunition. Behind every tank came mechanics, fuel convoys, replacement parts, engineers, and reinforcements. Behind every attack came another attack. German soldiers often watched in disbelief as American supply columns stretched for miles along roads throughout France and Belgium. The flow seemed endless. Destroy a tank and another appeared. Knock out an artillery battery and fresh guns arrived. Ambush a convoy and another convoy followed behind it. One captured German officer reportedly remarked that fighting the Americans felt less like fighting an army and more like fighting a factory. The statement was closer to the truth than he realized. By 1944, the industrial power of the United States had reached a scale almost impossible for Germany to comprehend. American factories produced tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, artillery pieces, and military equipment in numbers that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could achieve. German intelligence officers knew the statistics. American production lines turned out thousands of aircraft every month. New tanks rolled from factories faster than German forces could destroy them. Cargo ships crossed the Atlantic carrying mountains of supplies that seemed limitless. To the average German soldier on the front line, these numbers were not abstract statistics. They were reality. Every time an American attack was stopped, another one followed. Every time German artillery destroyed enemy equipment, replacements appeared. Every time German commanders believed they had exhausted American resources, more arrived. The effect on morale was devastating. German prisoners captured during the final years of the war often spoke about a feeling of helplessness that had little to do with individual battles. Many still believed German soldiers were better trained. Many believed German officers were tactically superior. Some even believed German equipment was technically better. But none of that seemed to matter, because every tactical success felt temporary. A German unit might hold a defensive position for a day, perhaps even a week. They might inflict heavy casualties and destroy dozens of vehicles. Yet somehow the Americans always returned. More artillery, more tanks, more trucks, more men. The pressure never ended. One German veteran later recalled that the most exhausting part of fighting Americans was not the combat itself. It was the certainty that no matter what happened, the Americans would keep coming. That certainty became especially apparent after the Normandy landings. German defenders fought stubbornly across the hedgerows of France. They inflicted severe casualties on advancing Allied forces and delayed their progress for weeks. Entire American units became trapped in difficult terrain where every field could become a battlefield. Yet despite the resistance, the American advance continued. Slowly at first, then faster still. The breakout from Normandy unleashed a flood of men and machinery unlike anything German forces had experienced before. American armored columns raced across France, supply trucks filled roads from horizon to horizon, fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements poured into the continent at astonishing speed. German soldiers began noticing something unusual. The sound of American engines was everywhere. It echoed through villages. It rolled across open countryside. It filled roads day and night. For many German troops, that sound became symbolic of the entire war. The engines represented something larger than tanks or trucks. They represented an enemy whose strength seemed impossible to exhaust. As Germany's own situation deteriorated, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Fuel shortages crippled military operations. Ammunition became scarce. Replacement vehicles arrived less frequently. New recruits were younger, older, and less prepared than those who had fought earlier in the war. Meanwhile, American forces appeared to suffer from none of these problems. As the war entered its final stages, many German soldiers reached a painful conclusion. They were no longer fighting a campaign that could be won through superior tactics or battlefield skill alone. They were fighting a nation whose resources appeared endless. That realization changed everything. Captured German soldiers often described the same feeling after the war. They did not necessarily believe American troops were unbeatable because of individual combat ability. They believed they were unbeatable because every American soldier was backed by an industrial system capable of replacing any loss. The distant rumble of engines became a reminder of that reality. Those engines meant fuel. Those engines meant ammunition. Those engines meant reinforcements. Those engines meant artillery. Those engines meant another attack. And unlike Germany, America never seemed to run out. Years later, historians studying prisoner interrogations and post-war interviews noticed the same theme appearing again and again. German veterans remembered many things about fighting the Americans. They remembered the artillery. They remembered the fighter bombers. They remembered the overwhelming firepower. But they also remembered the engines, the endless movement of vehicles, the endless supply columns, the endless stream of equipment heading toward the front. For the German soldier sitting in that frozen foxhole in December 1944, the rumble of engines through the Ardennes forest was more than just noise. It was a warning, a reminder that Germany's resources were shrinking while America's continued to grow. A reminder that every battle had become harder than the last. And a reminder that somewhere beyond those trees, another wave of American soldiers was already on its way. That was why the sound terrified them, because long before the first tank appeared, long before artillery opened fire, long before infantry emerged from the forest, those engines carried a message every German soldier understood. The Americans were coming. And this time, just like every time before, they were bringing more than Germany could ever hope to stop. But what surprised German commanders was how quickly that learning happened. Many armies in history have recovered from defeat. Very few managed to do it while fighting a global war. American commanders carefully studied what had gone wrong in North Africa. Reports were written, Training programs were revised. Officers who performed poorly were replaced. New tactics were introduced. Lessons learned on one battlefield were distributed across entire formations. German veterans who encountered American forces later in the war often remarked that they seemed to be fighting a different army altogether. The inexperienced units that had struggled at Kasserine Pass gradually transformed into a force that coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air power with increasing effectiveness. This ability to adapt worried German commanders because it removed one of their greatest advantages. Throughout the war, German officers had often relied on experience. Many had spent years mastering modern warfare. Many had participated in campaigns across Europe and the Soviet Union. They expected their opponents to require years to reach the same level of effectiveness. The Americans appeared determined to shorten that process. Every mistake became a lesson. Every setback became training. Every defeat became preparation for the next battle. By 1944, German soldiers who had once dismissed American troops were beginning to speak about them very differently. Not because they believed Americans were naturally superior soldiers, but because they seemed capable of solving problems faster than almost anyone else. For the German soldier sitting in that frozen foxhole in December 1944, the rumble of engines through the Ardennes forest was more than just noise. It was a warning, a reminder that Germany's resources were shrinking while America's continued to grow. A reminder that every battle had become harder than the last, and a reminder that somewhere beyond those trees, another wave of American soldiers was already on its way. That was why the sound terrified them, because long before the first tank appeared, long before artillery opened fire, and long before infantry emerged from the forest, those engines carried a message every German soldier understood. The Americans were coming. But by late 1944, the fear wasn't really about the Americans themselves. It was about what they represented. They represented factories operating day and night thousands of miles away. They represented cargo ships crossing entire oceans. They represented endless trains, endless trucks, endless fuel, and endless ammunition. Most importantly, they represented time. Every month that passed strengthened the United States and weakened Germany. Every battle won by German troops became harder to replace. Every loss became more difficult to recover from. And eventually, many German soldiers came to understand something their leaders had failed to accept. Wars are not always won by the army that fights the hardest. They are not always won by the army with the best weapons. And they are not always won by the army with the most experienced soldiers. Sometimes they are won by the nation that can endure the longest. The nation that can replace its losses. The nation that can keep moving forward when everyone else is running out of options. That is what those engines meant. Not just another attack. Not just another convoy, not just another battle. They were the sound of a war Germany could no longer win.